Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is a call to arms for those American patriots who, in the tradition of our founding fathers, will stand up now to defend the Constitution and the liberties that it guarantees to each citizen, to each of us. That is our mission, to explain in a clear and concise manner the direct effect of each issue on the individual, on you personally, not some anonymous being in a distant place, and to define in no uncertain terms the consequences of inaction. Let the battle begin.
Well, hello, this is Dr. Dan, and it's a pleasure to be here. Last summer, the park fire near Chico, California, was making news as the largest wildfire of the year. It was supposedly started when a 42-year-old Chico man allegedly pushed a burning vehicle down a ravine. Who knows what or who was inside the vehicle, by the way, but the alleged arsonist was arrested and the fire was contained. Now, of course, that's past and mostly forgotten, except by the victims. But now Los Angeles is on fire with billions of dollars damaged to million-dollar homes of people who expect to be protected from adversity by their wealth and fame. When that happens, the search for reasons and culprits is inevitable. All too soon, and all too often, the victims get left in the debris while the offenders and perpetrators are ignored and exonerated. The problems and causes are discussed and debated without a solution. But no one forgets a debacle of this magnitude because it is a source of social media opinions without factual basis and speculations about conspiracies that are rarely proven. So let's get the facts from an expert. Frank Carroll is the managing partner of Professional Forest Management, LLC, yes, Professional Forest Management, LLC. They are wildfire expert consultants. Visit their website if you want. Their website is wildfirepros.com. So that's who we're talking with today, Frank Carroll, and we're talking to him because he is an expert. He's going to give us the truth and the facts. Fires generate smoke and smoke screens. Much of the noise is in the system of BS, but I'll bet you that Dr. Dan's guest, my guest, Frank Carroll, a wildfire pro, can explain what's real and what is not real. So, Frank Carroll, welcome to the program today. Let me get you up here on the screen properly. There we go. And there you are. There we are together, Frank Carroll, and let us start talking. So what's happening in LA, Frank? What's happening in LA with this fire situation, and how did they end up in such a mess? That's what I want to know.
Holy smoke. So,
by God, you said the magic word. The duck's going to come down and give you $200. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You know, I'll bet there was something like that long ago in the past. A duck that gave money to the right answer. So
yes, they did, as a matter of fact.
Yeah,
that was Groucho Marx.
Yeah, no. Yeah. You must be an old guy. I can tell by
yeah, I have. Yeah, I used to watch that on television. You know, those were the days when you didn't have to worry about people stealing your TV set. It weighed about 500 pounds.
I, re- I
It
remember
took a
that.
crew.
Yeah, I
But,
remember that. I couldn't believe it when flat screens finally made it.
yeah.
So,
So anyway, so go on. Let's get to the subject here. What's happening in LA with the fire situation? How did they end up with such a mess?
California is an enigma in many ways. It's a spectacular state. When I was a kid, it was so much fun to go to California and, be in San Diego where it's 75 degrees all the time, and up and down the coast of Ventura and Santa Monica and so on. And it was kind of a heaven on earth spot really in those days. And that wasn't that long ago, 60 years maybe. But because of that, it attracted a lot of people. Love California, and they went there for a lot of reasons. And Hollywood and in World War II, it exploded because of the aircraft industry. They built a lot of airplanes in California because they could count on the weather. And so they built giant factories. And so all these people moved there and they stayed. And the people brought in their favorite plants like eucalyptus, which was not a native, and so on. And they grew a lot of trees, many of which had high volatility, full of terpenes and so on, that when they get dry and you light them on fire, they explode. And then people, because land was so valuable, people built their homes neck and neck, literally, a few feet apart from each other, even some many high-end homes. And the net result of all of that was you have all this vegetation in a Mediterranean climate where it grows beautifully, just like Spain and Greece and so on, where the terrible fires have been happening the last few years. And you stuff all those houses made out of wood and all that vegetation together in one place. And then you throw in a 10-month drought, and it's a nightmare. I was just there in June and up in Montecito making an advertisement for a spectacular product called Citrotech, which is a fire inhibitor. You spray it on any kind of organic, and you can't light it on fire. It's unbelievable. And so it's the most revolutionary product. And I don't know all the history that I know of wildfire prevention. And I remember as we were driving up into those hills where old Prince Harry and the Megs are hanging out and so on, what we were all thinking about was, how would you get out of here? When it lights on fire, how do you get out of here? It's very rural and lovely and beautiful plants and so on up until it's all on fire, and then it's not so pretty. And so that's kind of the setup, the drought, the people maxed in next to each other, and the vegetation. And then of course you needed a spark. And in this case, there are probably multiple causes of these fires. And the investigations are underway. So I don't know I don't have a definitive answer about what caused the fires, but it appears there was probably a combination of power line failures in Southern California, Edison, and also in the city of Los Angeles has its own power company system. And it appears that there were a couple of major failures with those systems, although that's under investigation. But the preliminary information we have from our people there is that was the case. And then they've been, a fire, any fire is a good excuse to go out and light another fire, right? And so here came the arsonists, and there were people with blowtorches trying to light everything on fire. And it's a mess. It's a giant, massive, tragic mess. But it's got all the elements that we're very familiar with. And California is highly reliable for firefighters and for people who make their careers out of wildfire prevention and control. California burns like clockwork. It burns down. They rebuild it exactly the same way in the same place. a few years go by. The rains come in the fall and in the spring, and it all floods and everything washes down to the ocean. They rebuild it. A year or two later, it all burns down again, and it's just a cyclic, amazing mess.
So what you really have is you have a natural and created tinderbox. Everything is flammable there. I mean, I'm sure there's some homes that are only partially flammable if they have, stucco walls or something like that, or rock or something like that. But you have a giant tinderbox, natural plants that people brought in that are burnable, and the all next to each other. So it's easy for fire to jump from one place to the next, to the next, to the next. Uh, there's really nothing. You can't have. You don't have. You can't have a fire break when your houses are only 10 feet apart.
So
Just not possible.
that's exactly right. I mean, so when one of the tragedies that keeps occurring in California is because of land values and the small size of lots and the large size of houses. When a subdivision or an area that's packed with homes like Pacific Palisades or Santa Paula or wherever it is, when one or two of the houses light, the radiant heat and embers from those burning homes light the houses next door, the houses behind them. Those houses then compound, and pretty soon you had two houses on fire, and now you've got four, now you've got eight, now you've got 16. And that's exactly what happened out there. I remember the news as the news was coming through about these fires, and people were trying not to speculate, and so they didn't want to overstate the case, and so they were saying, maybe 500 homes burned, maybe it might be up to 1,000 homes. But those of us with experience in these matters thought, man, it's thousands of homes. The Camp Fire, in similar wind conditions and so on, burned 19,000 homes and businesses in basically a day.
Now, when and where was the Camp Fire?
The Camp Fire was up to the north east of Sacramento, California, up in the Middle Fork of the Feather River country. It's extremely steep and extremely flammable. There are old mining communities and logging communities and so on. And so it was. It's by Oroville, I guess it'd be a close place that people might know. And the town is called Paradise. So they called the town Paradise for dang good reasons. It's high enough up in the hills and so on, so you don't have the heat of the Central Valley. It's low enough so the weather's nice, et cetera, et cetera. And when a power line dropped into the canyons of the Middle Fork of the Feather River, that fire overwhelmed that town. Many people, more than 80 people died, many of them in their cars trying to escape. And that's what was happening in Los Angeles. People jumped in their cars and they were trying to get out. And, some people in the front of the line got spooked and abandoned their cars without pulling off the road and ran down to the beach. And so the Cal Fire bulldozers, friend of mine has a buddy who was running one of the red dozers there. They call them the red dozers, which are the Cal Fire dozers. And they were running down the street pushing, $80,000 cars out of the way.
Well, I mean, that's just a total system failure in my eyes, because when you have a situation like that, you have to have an escape route. You have to have an escape plan, and people need to be informed of it, and their actions need to be told to them in advance. And if the sirens are going off, here is what you guys are going to do. Don't block the road for everyone. You're going to get in your car. If you want to get in your car, put the pedal to the metal, move it on out of there. But there's got to be some kind of a plan. And if you don't have a plan, that's why people get trapped, and that's why people die.
It's so frustrating. We call that ingress and egress. We require subdivisions and communities and so on to have ingress and egress. And it's the human factors in planning to escape these kinds of situations are so paramount. And I'll give you an example. Lake Tahoe, which is another disaster waiting to happen, windy little driveways and little roads and so on, where people with tens of millions of dollars homes live and interspersed with other folks and so on. And the city, the municipalities there have long believed that they have sufficient highways and ingress and egress to get people out of there in about 3 hours. And they just, a group of people there, different groups, pooled their money, and they had a study done. And the study found that a minimum of 12 hours would be needed to pull people out of there. And by then, there's a whole bunch of dead people. Right. And it's the same way with plans. So after a deal like this, the fire departments are going to have people's attention for about 6 months, maybe a year. And people are going to, oh yeah, and they're going to bear down and so on. And then pretty soon the vagaries of life take over, and the bills need to be paid, and they've got stuff to do, and it just kind of dwindles away. Yeah, they know the eucalyptus are growing outside, but they just don't have time or skill or money to do anything about it. So we'll probably be all right. And pretty soon, in 2 years or so, nobody can remember that there was a problem. And so in some ways, government is really hamstrung, because there are people working in Los Angeles and in San Diego Fire and different places. They're all over the place there, who absolutely are committed to the things that you just talked about in terms of planning and helping people understand what to do and so on. And they have, 30-year careers there, spending their time trying to help people understand these things, only to watch it all fall apart in the event.
Well, this is pretty common, and not just with fires. It is common, for instance, in areas where there are hurricanes. South Florida is a good example. Every single time there's a major event like that, you see pictures of the highways clogged with people trying to get out. A couple of stalled vehicles can absolutely ruin any kind of an evacuation plan. And the other problem, of course, is you've got a hardcore of people that say, I ain't leaving. And then you have the other hardcore people saying, I'm not leaving. And then at the very last minute, they say, I better get my ass out of here. So you put all that together, and that's a disaster waiting to happen, no matter what the crisis is. No matter what that crisis is. And in California here with this fire, there was a lot of that, I know, because I read about accounts of people said, I'm not going to leave. And there was this guy who was busy with his garden hose, trying to keep his house from burning down, and he ended up burning up himself. That happens a lot, I'm sure. People think they can. People underestimate. They tend to underestimate the severity of these events. Fire is terrifying. Fire of that heat is going to progress. Fire of that heat will destroy everything in its path. There is no compromise with a blaze of that size, just like there's no compromise with a Category 5 hurricane. None at all. Yes, you may think you can swim, or that your house will stand up, or you have a boat, or whatever you might in your mind think is going to be okay, make it okay for you. It ain't, because those kind of events are the kind of events you need to run away from and hide from in a safe place, and then come back after the event passes.
One of the real shocking things for people is that water doesn't put out fire when you're at that scale. The people that can use water effectively have giant trucks with PTO pumps and huge engines, and they can put out, a swimming pool's worth of water every hour, half hour to an hour. And even at that, they're only able to save small little areas. And then fire is so strange because it'll burn through a neighborhood and burn everything down except for, 3 houses that are randomly stationed through the area. Why didn't it burn them too? I don't know. The Australians have been experimenting with leave or stay policy, meaning people can decide in a mandatory evacuation, they can decide to stay and save their place if they can. And they didn't lose a house in the Australian Capital Territory from 1952 to 2003. And then, of course, they lost hundreds of houses for a lot of reasons that didn't have to do with the policy. It had to do with they went from 70,000 volunteer firefighters in 1952 to 300 or 400 in 2003. And that's also happening everywhere. The people that used to, so, in our more rural days, and especially after World War I and II, we had a bunch of trained soldiers and a bunch of equipment, and those people knew how to get together and, pull out all the stops and put out the fires and do whatever they needed to do. And that generation has passed by, and what's left are the rest of us now, kind of focused on our little piece of the world and our little screens in front of us, and we're not outside working with each other to figure out how to save ourselves. I had an interesting experience. I love my neighborhood, but it's also it's a fire trap. In a strong easterly wind, I'd probably be toast. But anyway, I went around trying to convince my neighbors we needed to cut out most of the juniper that grows around us, because juniper is the only green wood. You can cut juniper as green right now this morning and throw it in your Vermont casting stove over there, Dan, and it burns wonderfully well. And unfortunately, it does the same thing in a wildfire. So, people thought that was a lot of people that come into this part of the country. Maybe they come from places out on the plains or whatever, where green trees are important. And that's certainly true in California. Those guys love plants. They love how gardens grow, and how I was looking at sedums and different succulent plants in Montecito, and they were as big as, car tires. It was unbelievable. And that's wonderful. But the problem with that is, of course, that, they grow as big as a car tire. When things catch on fire, it can be a problem. So, there's so many things. And so, yes, people were woefully, President Trump was on Rogan, Joe Rogan, before the election. And he was talking about this situation in California. He's not wrong. I don't know about his timing jumping in on people in the middle of the crisis, but he's not wrong about what it takes to do. And people are looking around and saying to themselves, why, what are our societal priorities? So there's several parts to this. What are our priorities as a society? Is it to support the war in Ukraine? Maybe. To support the Israelis? Yeah. Give them, bunker busters and let them dig up Hamas or whatever. So, but we have these priorities, and then all of a sudden our own cities are burning to the ground because there hadn't been enough money or will to do anything. That's one part of it. But another part of it is, if you went through those neighborhoods a week before the fire with 1,000 firefighters armed with chainsaws and all kinds of stuff, masticating machines, and offered those people to take out all the flammable vegetation that's so dangerous to them, they would have told you to get the hell off the property.
Right, and I understand that. And this is really a two-part. That's simplifying it, but that whole tinderbox concept, the availability of flammable material, that's really a two-part issue, in the sense that you have cities and towns where that's a problem, and you have forest areas where it's also a problem. And one of the things that Trump was referring to was the Forest Service owns, and the U.S. government own, far more land than they can ever take care of. And that is a problem, because what happens is that in the beginning, and I have a wonderful series of pictures, back in 1909, there's a place in the National Forest, and there's a man on horseback there, and he was able to gallop his horse through the National Forest without any problem whatsoever. And over the next 80 years, they took a picture of him on his horse in the same location. And over that 80 years, it came to the point where not only was he not able to gallop through the forest, you couldn't even walk through the forest. And the reason was very simply that when trees died and fell down, when branches fell and whatever, no one ever cleaned them up. And when new plant growth occurred in the middle of it all, it absolutely cluttered up the forest to the point where there was no room to actually walk through the forest. Now, I say this to the federal government. If you own the land and you can't take it, you can't take care of it properly, you need to give it back. If you're going to take our tax dollars and steal our land for the national forest, you better be able to take care of it. They have demonstrated over the last 80 years, they have zero ability to do that. So if you are the federal government or state government, you take private land, make it public land, and then let it lie fallow and get destroyed, you need to give it back to the owners, the real owners, because
Yeah,
it's not
I mean,
fair. I mean, if you can't take care of it, you don't belong owning it. That's the way I feel about it with the
there's a
government.
strong, there's a strong basis for that. Statehood included, provisions that the federal government would have control of the land until the states could get organized, and then they'd start turning over stuff to the states. Only that part two never really happened. But so there have been movements in the West as long as I've been around. I guess maybe they started in the they probably started in the 50s. And what was happening, as you know very well, was that people were saying exactly what you're saying. Let people who know the land and love the land and know how to care for it and so on take care of it. And there was a time when the Forest Service when my dad was a forest ranger and when I joined the Forest Service, that's the agency that we worked for. We did timber sales and we thinned stuff out, and you talked about what happened with the forests. There's many books that are called repeat photography, where they took like the 1874 Custer expedition to the Black Hills. He had a photographer named Illingworth with him, and Illingworth took spectacular photos of the Black Hills in those days when the Sioux Indians were still pretty much in charge. And then Paul Horsted went back in 2000 and again in 2020 and repeated those photographs. And the explosion of new trees everywhere is just, it's astounding. The density of forests has increased across the West because of we have this unfortunate environment. The people that call themselves environmentalists in this country have a really myopic view of natural systems. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton had the Northwest Forest Plan in Washington and Oregon. And what that was an attempt to favor spotted owls. It was also a strategy to shut down logging and end the practice of using our timber that God gave us that grows naturally up out of the ground that we should be using and that all our homes are built with. And but they had two objectives. The first was to try to save the spotted owls, so they designated all these buffer zones, they called them, and these core habitats and these big areas where nobody could do anything and you couldn't operate certain times of the year and so on because you'd disturb the owls. Never mind that the owls have been around for millions of years without, being worried about chainsaws.
Without our help, right?
Yeah. And so they did that. And all these big fires that we've been seeing and reading about since 1992 have burned all that habitat that they were saving, like Disneyland, burned it all down, killed a bunch of owls to the extent that now barred owls, which are an eastern owl, have moved into the Pacific Northwest and they're out competing the what's the other owl called? Damned owls. They're out competing the little owl, their little brother, spotted owl. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service in this last administration hit on a brilliant idea. Let's shoot 450,000 barred owls to help out the spotted owls. And, that doesn't work. Ethnic cleansing of any species for another species does not work. It's a
I mean,
God,
that is really hilarious. I just have to laugh when I hear stuff like that.
It's tragic. So
it's tragic. It's tragic because these plans that they come up with are stupid to begin with, because they don't take into account that the resilience of Mother Nature. Mother Nature is competitive. And when one species competes with the other, well, that's the way things have been for forever and ever. Even before mankind was here, when the dinosaurs ruled the earth, they had species that competed, and some lived and some didn't live. But mankind cannot manipulate natural species activity, natural selection, and the interaction between species with things that don't really matter. And this whole concept of, well, if you don't like what's going on, kill all the ones you don't want, and then on the other side say, I am a humanitarian, or I am doing good for the world. I just killed 450,000 barred owls, but
how does
we
that
didn't like them anyway.
It doesn't make any sense on any level.
No.
Anyway, I think that'll shut down here in a few days, which would be good. But the point, getting back to the national forest in California, we lost our way, and there were a bunch of reasons for that. The Forest Service had done an outstanding job of supporting rural communities, of everybody and their brother did something for the government because it was their government. They staffed fire lookouts. They they ran their cows on the national forest and kept the fine fuels down. They logged trees and were able to make a living for themselves and their communities and so on. And things were going well. And in 1970, my dad kept a letter from the then chief of the Forest Service to everybody talking about the new public planning, rational planning model that was coming out, and how excited they were to involve the public in forest management. But what they did inadvertently was they handed power over national forest management and our intentions in forest management for public, the greater good of the greatest number over time. They handed the power to stop all of that to a small group of determined people led by the Centers for Biological Diversity, the Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, et cetera, to shut down the rational, ancient, traditional, wonderful uses of the national forest to help people. We protect natural resources because natural resources protect people. We don't protect them just for fun. It's not Disneyland where we can put a big glass dome over everything and come in every once in a while and touch it up with a little paint. If you try to put a big glass dome over everything, you're creating a giant vegetative equilibrium that eventually is going to explode in some kind of huge disturbance, and so it's a big problem. So the Forest Service not only lost its way, but they're now out of the principal business that we wanted them to be in, which is the caretakers of our public forests. And there's a guy named Zeke Lunder, who's just a brilliant analyst, who runs a website called The Lookout, and he does these detailed, amazing, kind of real-time analytics, and he has been on the Los Angeles fires as well, about what's happening, why it's happening, what the history is, and so on. And he said earlier this summer, he said in one of his casts that the U.S. Forest Service is out of business, that they're not good at any of the things that we wanted them to be good at, including firefighting. And in this case, these fires in Los Angeles are not a Forest Service issue. They're private property owners in the state of California and the counties and so on. It's on a little bit different scale, but the Forest Service is out of business for all intents and purposes. And they've also lost their way in fire control. They've decided that the only way to get the national forest into some kind of equilibrium is to allow and encourage wildfires to burn. And so on the Mogollon Rim in north of Phoenix, Arizona, since December, I forget now, 15th or so, they've not only allowed a fire called the Horton Fire to burn, they've also expanded it. They took a 50-acre fire and turned it into 8,000 acres. Why? They did it because they're like the spotted owls and the barred owls and so on. They're helping nature by allowing these fires to burn and by burning stuff on purpose. So what they did was illegal in my view. They executed a prescribed fire for natural resource purposes. They didn't do any of the paperwork. They didn't involve any of the public. They didn't ask anybody's permission. And they spent $10 million to burn 8,000 acres over almost a month. Why are we okay with that? And so the agency that takes money from Congress, our money, for emergency fire suppression, is now using that money for these giant expensive projects that used to require disclosure of environmental impacts and so on. And now they avoid all of that by lying. They lie. They say that they're in full suppression mode, and they're fighting this fire in full suppression mode, which is bullshit. Full suppression means, like when I was a hotshot squad boss, we went out there and we cut fire line direct against the fire everywhere we could, and we put it out. And that's not what they do now. So not only has the agency lost its ability to manage the forest, to cut timber, to provide range, forage, and so on, they've also lost the ability to fight fire in any convincing, rational way. And so California has got this massive, most of the Western states have massive federal ownership. And in California's case, it's also true. And these big, beautiful forests full of, 6-foot diameter trees that are 200 feet tall and so on, redwoods and sequoias, et cetera, are being systematically burned for religious purposes. There's no science behind this notion that you can just light everything on fire and it's all going to come back beautifully. And we know that because the trees they're burning down are 400 years old. They didn't have this kind of fire in the past.
So there is, of course, a lot of talk on social media that these fires are part of a government plot to steal private property. In a way, you have confirmed that right now the Forest Service, their policy is to take a simple fire and instead of putting it out, of not only allowing it to burn, but to say, okay, we are going to make this fire burn and destroy X amount of acres. And if we have to light areas on fire to do it, we are going to do it. Is that pretty much what's going on?
Yeah. And it's not. So we argued before the federal court in Utah last year that was exactly the case where the Pole Creek 2018 Pole Creek fire is concerned. And the judge didn't buy it because the judge rightly believed that the Forest Service didn't set out to intentionally burn all these people's homes and property and so on. And I don't think they did either. But when you make a decision like the forest supervisor that did there on the Uinta National Forest, and when he decided to allow a smoldering log to burn in a light rainstorm, and they sent in 5 firefighters, and the forest supervisor ordered them to leave the fire and let it burn for natural resource management purposes. When he made that decision, he's pulling the trigger on a shotgun at all of his neighbors. The fire doesn't understand about administrative boundaries, and so it didn't stay on the national forest. It burned huge swaths of private property everywhere. So the Forest Service, did they intentionally mean to do that? I don't know. Do they feel in their heart of hearts that it's okay to let these fires burn and then to light them even bigger? on purpose, like they did in Arizona right now. Um, Maybe they do some at some level, but it doesn't matter what their intent is. What's happening is they're in fact committing the whole country, especially in the West, to this radical, irrational fire policy of, they call it reintroducing fire to fire depleted ecosystems. And when I think about that, it's infuriating. And I think about Los Angeles and I think, huh, do you guys feel like you're living in a fire depleted ecosystem? And now that fire's been reintroduced to your neighborhoods, how do you feel about that policy?
Well, Frank, isn't there currently a suit in Montana where some farms were destroyed because of this purposely set fires that were allowed to burn instead of being properly put out? I believe somewhere
Yeah,
in western
The Alice Creek fire.
the
Uh,
Alice Creek fire. Yes, in
yep,
western Montana.
yep. It went to trial a few months ago, and I haven't heard any outcome of that to date. I don't have any current news on it, but that's exactly what it was. There were two ranchers, two big ranches suing the Forest Service because they let a fire burn in the wilderness on the far side of a granite divide, thinking it wouldn't do any harm to anybody, and of course it came over the top, and then they lit a bunch of fire on purpose to stop the fire, but for whatever reason they lit a bunch of fire on purpose and it burned down these big ranches. So yeah, it's like having a neighbor who's an arsonist and you can't do anything about it.
Well, what we're seeing here is deliberate destruction of public lands using fire for so-called with quotation marks so-called environmental good purposes. And when things get out of hand, innocent people can be killed, private property is destroyed, and that to me is really validates what Trump was saying, where the left, the Democrats, with their environmental policies, are not being good stewards of the environment that they are claiming to protect. The side effect is death and destruction of private land. So, in a sense, they are using, in this case, fire to steal public land because, in terms of rebuilding, isn't that somewhat of a problem, rebuilding in these areas? I don't imagine when you have these huge areas that are just turned into blackened fire pits. I don't see how it's that easy to get to be rebuilding them. What do you think?
They People do rebuild. What it amounts to, though, is really an interesting point. When the government makes these kinds of decisions, let's say that it's fine. It's fine if you want to do that. You have the power. You can let these fires burn if you want, which is what a recent court decision said. You can let these fire in the Ferris lumber case versus United States. The court found that the Forest Service can do just about anything they want. There's no standard about how they should fight fire. So if they want to let them burn, and then if they want to expand them by burning and so on, that's fine. They've got the power to do that. Let's say that that's true. We accept that premise. If that's the case, then what they're doing is inverse condemnation. They're seizing my private property and they're burning it for public purposes. Okay, if that's what they're doing, that's fine. You got the power to do that too. Now you need to compensate me for the loss of my property. And that whole piece is missing completely.
Well, that piece is missing. In addition to which, government compensation never is true value,
No,
ever. So
no.
basically, these people get screwed. And so that concept that fire is being used to confiscate or steal private land really is true. It really is happening. Uh, that is like Kelo versus Connecticut or any of the other eminent domain cases that have gone through the court system and to the Supreme Court. Uh, the government does have the right to take private property for public use, but that now has gotten to the point where they can do it for almost any reason and by any technique they want. And the compensation, as I said before, is never, ever fair or correct for what
Or
the true
timely.
value is. Or timely. That's true.
You know,
So,
I don't know. It's a mess, and if it's not a mess, it'll do until a mess gets there. Right now, you were right. You mentioned earlier the search for the innocent, the search for and punishment of the innocent. We'll see a lot of that going on because everybody's deflecting right now. And they're not, in fairness to Gavin Newsom and LA government and so on, uh, they can't force people to do smart stuff. They can make the resources available. They can make the experts available to help people. But when it comes to cutting down that stand of eucalyptus trees all over the back of the house that Grandma planted back in 1944, they can't force them to do that. At least I hope they can't. And because of that, there's this giant soup, and it's a circular firing squad. I heard you say something about that a while back. A circular firing squad where something bad happens and then everybody stands around shooting at each other on either side of the circle in every direction, and so that piece is also troubling. But we know what it takes to have fire in proximity to communities. It takes a whole host of things, one of which is the Oakland fire was a very similar kind of fire a number of years ago. And it was famous because of the number of houses that burned. I don't remember. It was like 1,200 homes burned with a very small fire, 3,000 acre fire and 1,200 homes. And everybody's panicked about that. But one of the famous pictures from the Oakland fire is this blackened hillside, just looks like what we're looking at now with all these burned down houses and everything. And in the middle of it sits this house. And it's just there, happy as can be. And that house was, an engineer decided to build a house that wouldn't be susceptible to fire. And he built it out of poured and preformed concrete. And so he was basically living in a bunker, a nice bunker, it's a good looking house. But yeah, the fire raged all around him and didn't harm him at all. And so people don't want to live in a neighborhood like that. And if you're worried about environmental impacts, producing all the concrete that it would take to replicate those neighborhoods and so on would be quite an event. So
well, but Frank, one of the things that we've talked about, which we could kind of quickly reiterate, is the fact that what can you do to protect your home? And the answer is get as much flammable material away from your home as you possibly can. It's kind of like a fire break that you should do when the forest is on fire. You want to remove flammable material as far away from your home as possible. That'll help you. Of course, in a major conflagration like they've had now, I don't think that would probably help because the heat is too high. But in smaller fires, not having a bunch of flammable material up against the wall of your house would probably be a good thing to consider. Wouldn't you think?
well, so it's limited, and unfortunately, yes. You should harden your home. You should build with materials that won't ignite, like concrete shingles on the roof instead of asphalt and so on. But the single factor in a forest fire that's most dangerous for homes and everything else is the ember storm that runs ahead of a fire. So that ember storm, as the fire's building and the smoke column's building and it's all this convective heat, it's moving up into the air and it's picking up football size, embers. and throwing them 10 miles downrange to start more fires. And then in front of it is this wave of embers. And you've probably seen pictures of that. It's like a snowstorm of fiery embers that run ahead of the fire. And so even if you've cleared all of the flammable material 100 feet or whatever, 6 feet, whatever people recommend now, away from the house, you still have the ember storm to deal with. And so, one of the fascinating things to me is a couple of years ago, I heard this guy make this absolutely BS claim. He said that he had this stuff called Citratec that he'd invented, that is clear as water and heavy. It's made up of metal salts. It's an EPA Safer Choice Award product. It's won't hurt kids, dogs, puppies, fish, etc. And he said if you spray that stuff on any kind of organic stuff, fences, firewood, anything in advance of a fire, even weeks in advance of a fire, so that it's bone dry, you can't burn the stuff down that this Citratec is on. And I said, you can't make a claim like that. That's ridiculous. So he flew me out to Rohnert Park out by Oakland. And he took some Christmas trees and there were a bunch of insurance underwriters there and fire departments and so on. And he took a couple of Christmas trees. I have video of this. I'll share it with you so that you can load it if you want to. And one of them, they're both several months old. They're both absolutely so dry that, needles fall off them when you touch them. And he had treated one with the Citratec and the other not. And they lit the one that wasn't treated on fire and it blew up like a bomb, which is what those Christmas trees do in your house. And the other one, they couldn't light it with a 3,500 degree torch. And so a number of famous places, I can't talk about them right now, but you know them and I'll tell you offline. We're calling the Citratec people for the last week and sending armies to gather, equipment and sprayers and Citratec and go spray places that they wanted to save. And so if you do a combination, my point is, if you do a combination of hardening your house and trimming your trees and, keeping the bushes away from the back and stacking your firewood in the backyard and that kind of stuff, that's great. But the missing piece is, what do you do about the embers? And so now there's a really viable thing you can do about the embers as well. And, there are a lot of wildfire defense systems out there, but there's only one chemistry that we're aware of that actually inhibits fire, won't allow stuff to burn. So there are tools coming online that are going to make it easier for people. When people first look at their yard that they grew up in the house, and the little trees they planted when they were kids and so on are suddenly, 70 feet high and 35 feet wide and highly flammable. It's overwhelming to think about going out there and cutting it down or cutting up the limbs, high enough off the ground so fire on the ground won't light them on fire. Things like that. It's just crazy difficult for a lot of people, age or just lack of skills or no money or whatever it is, reason why they can't. And the thing about things like Citratec is they give people an opportunity to survive the fire and start again, next year, try and do something about all the vegetation. So we have tools now that we didn't have before. And so I think it's important for people to look at what are they really trying to do if you really want to live in that kind of environment. And I do. I used Citratec, sprayed all my fences. I've got 550 feet of cedar fences out here, which normally act as a fuse in a fire situation. They catch on fire and then they burn all the way up to the house and burn the house down. And so I sprayed it, so a month or so into the summer after the rains had stopped. And then I had vertical fire lines instead of a problematic fence. So there are things that people can do that taken together make it possible for them to live in these areas. But it's so hit and miss. Maybe you do it over here to your house, but three of your neighbors don't over here, and so you still have the issue of intense radiant heat, which can also be a problem when houses are so close together. So it's really complex. And every time we think in our business that now the city planners and the county planners and the state and so on have an opportunity to require people to build in the ways that we're talking about, basically fire-worthy communities that if a fire does come, they don't all burn each other down. They don't do it. Why? In part because, it's my property and I don't want to live like that. I want to rebuild the house that I'm familiar with and that I love. And so,
Well, I think this is a common thread with all people. And anywhere you choose to live, there are hazards. And you have to choose how much protection you are going to be willing to use to save your property. A good example is places where hurricanes are a problem. There are ways you can construct buildings and houses where they are not immune, but certainly can withstand greater winds, greater rain, and greater storm strengths without crumbling like the homes from 100 years ago. A Category 1 would blow it into the ground. And now you can maybe withstand a Category 5 if you build it properly. And the same is true with fire protection. And you've gone through a number of different things that people can do. Plus the fact ingress and egress is extremely important in any area where you have risks. You have to be able to get out. And unfortunately, that means there are roads that are unpleasant in appearance. Let's call it that if you wish. But that's what's necessary if you do need to evacuate. But I believe in private property rights like you do. I'm an advocate, a strong advocate, and a fighter for property rights. And I do believe that you do have the right to do on your private property what you wish. The other side of that coin, however, is you have to be responsible for the decisions you make. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing here. People who do not challenge the risks, who do not take steps to mitigate the risks, but then on the other side are not willing to take the responsibilities for their actions, the results of their actions. That's really what's going on. You could say that as a blanket statement all over the place and apply it to any of the problems that people have. Make your decisions, make whatever decisions you want, but live with the results and take personal responsibility for the results of what happens to you.
I made a note.
Any final thoughts there? Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, a couple of things. I made a note at the top of our discussion earlier this morning, and I wrote down the right to own property and use it however you want and so on is also the right to lose that property through your negligence, and that gets to your point. One thing we haven't mentioned is that about 3 months before these fires hit Pacific Palisades and so on in LA, multiple insurance companies dropped fire insurance for these people. And so James Woods, believed that the actor believed that his house had burned to the ground and he'd lost everything. And it turned out that it had not, which was wonderful for him. But, what he pointed out was he and his neighbors had lost their fire insurance. And so if he'd had to rebuild his $12 million home, he would have had no help to get that done. And that's a crisis across the wildlands. It's coming to Colorado, Arizona, all these different places. And that's another reason that these inventions like Citrotech are so important, because, the point of insurance is when the fire comes and burns your house down, it's assistance to rebuild and try to recover and so on. The point of this chemistry and other activities is to keep the houses from burning down in the first place, no matter whether you have insurance or not. Insurance won't keep your house from burning down, but these other uh, tools will. So, yeah, it's a big mess, and I remember my dad fighting fire in California, leading Indian crews, the Hopis and Zunis and so on, in the Southwest out to California to fight fire. And it's deja vu. I mean, 1947, they were wrestling with the same stuff we're wrestling with today, albeit on a bigger scale today, but the same issues. So I don't know what the answer is, but it's a tragedy.
Well, Frank Carroll of wildfirepros.com. Go to their website. You'll be very much amazed at all the information that's on there. It's a good thing to go and see what the professionals have to say. Instead of speculating on social media, instead of making wild accusations that you don't know anything about, get the facts, and then you can speak with authority, speak with knowledge, say things that really matter. And Frank, Carol, you definitely have said a whole bunch that really matters today. So thank you for being a guest on this live version of Freedom Forum Radio about the Los Angeles fires. Not a government plot, totally. Government failure, probably quite a bit of it. People failure, definitely that's a part too. So we all have to share the blame, but like we both have said, take responsibility for your actions. You make a decision, you own it. Isn't that true?
It is true.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for being a guest on Live Freedom Forum.